Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it brings me great pleasure today to introduce to you and through you to all members of this Assembly some very special guests. In your gallery, Mr. Speaker, are Mr. Byung-Won Chung, the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Vancouver. Mr. Speaker, accompanying him is Mr. Yong Ukna, the Deputy Consul General. Mr. Speaker, this is the Consul General's first official visit to our province of Saskatchewan, and he has a very busy schedule during his stay here. The Consul General will be meeting with representatives, obviously from government, but also from industry, as well as our post-secondary institutions, and I look forward to meeting with the Consul General later this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, the Republic of Korea is one of the most remarkable nations on earth. In many ways, South Korea is an example for the rest of us in this world. It's a nation that has been described as the miracle of our time. And when you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue that description. Mr. Speaker, in just 50 years, South Korea has seen its GDP double 9 times. The value of its exports have grown more than 3,000%. The economic progress has been simply astonishing. But South Korea's impact goes far beyond commerce. It goes far beyond trade. Mr. Speaker, South Korea is a force for good across the globe, actively supporting world security by participating in UN peacekeeping missions. Soldiers from South Korea served alongside our Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan, defending freedom and defending democracy. Mr. Speaker, South Korea is an ally. They are a friend, and of course, they are an important trading partner of Saskatchewan. In 2018, Saskatchewan exported more than $100 million worth of goods to South Korea, including canola oil, including wheat, malt, and oats. These were among the exports that we sent to South Korea. Saskatchewan is also so very fortunate to have Korean companies as investors right here in our province. Korea Electric Power Corporation, for example, has uranium interests in Saskatchewan. The Korea National Oil Corporation has participated in the Aquastore CO2 storage demonstration project, and there are also numerous educational partnerships between our two jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, our relationship with South Korea is getting stronger by the day, and for that we are thankful. We have a deep and abiding friendship, and we look forward to strengthening that friendship in the days ahead. So I would ask all members to join me in welcoming our distinguished guests to the Saskatchewan Legislature here today.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a tremendous honour to join with the Premier here today to welcome this delegation to the Saskatchewan Assembly from the Republic of Korea. It's an incredible honour to have you within Saskatchewan. We value this relationship. It's an honour to welcome Mr. Byung-Won Chung, the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Vancouver, as well as Ms. Yong-Uk Na to the Saskatchewan Assembly. I understand it's the Consul General's first visit to Saskatchewan. We wish you a wonderful time here. I know it'll be busy. We value that relationship on so many fronts. Certainly, South Korea is a strong, stable force within the world, a force for good, and an important force and actor within the region. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, we value South Korea, the Republic of Korea, as an ally and as a friend from a trade perspective, from an education perspective, Mr. Speaker, but also by way of investment, Mr. Speaker, and as well as the fact that many Korean Canadians have chosen to build their lives here in Canada, here in Saskatchewan, and in so doing, building and bettering our province and our country together, Mr. Speaker. We value the trade agreement that's in place and expanding the important trade with respect to agriculture, Mr. Speaker, and our products. I'll note that the very proud Saskatoon berry is one of those items within that agreement, Mr. Speaker, and we value the trade with respect to canola oil and wheat and malt and oats, and I believe the trade, we actually sell the most oats to South Korea than anyone else in the world. So thank you so very much on that front. We wish you well in your stay, and we thank you as well for the partnerships with the universities of Regina and the universities of Saskatchewan. We'll recognize as well that the president of the University of Regina is the Consul General of Saskatchewan to Korea, Mr. Speaker, and we thank President Vian Timmins for that as well. And on behalf of the official opposition, it's a tremendous honor to welcome this delegation and these leaders to our Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while still on my feet, it's an honor to welcome a group of students to their Assembly and teachers that have joined us here today in the East Gallery. We have a large group, 60 visitors here today, grade 6s and 7s from Lakeview School. I'd ask them to give us a wave. These students are a remarkable bunch, Mr. Speaker, bright, strong, young leaders. I've witnessed their work in action over at Lakeview School. They've taken on climate change leadership, Mr. Speaker, and they actually put together a documentary, The Solar Generation, Mr. Speaker, that's remarkable and should inspire us all into action. So it's an honor to welcome them here today, as well as their teachers. Rachel Anderson, who I believe has been serving for, I'm told, 28 years. And that's a remarkable service, and we thank her for that service. I know her as an incredible teacher. And I'd also like to welcome Mr. Jared Clark that's here as well. Jared is a good friend and a good advisor, Mr. Speaker. He's a farmer along with his family in the Edenwald area, Mr. Speaker. He's a hunter, he's a fisher, he's a paddler, he's a biologist, he's a birder, Mr. Speaker. He's a conservationist. I had the pleasure of joining him this last weekend at the Ducks Unlimited dinner in Indian Head. We had a wonderful evening. But I welcome Jared here as a teacher, Rachel here as a teacher, and these friends to their Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to request leave for an extended introduction.
Minister's requested leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even with leave for an extended introduction, I'm sure that I will not be nearly as long as the member for Regina Rosemont in his introductions. However, Mr. Speaker, having said that, as one of the many recovering lawyers that are in this building right now, I'm pleased to introduce several visitors who are seated in the gallery this afternoon. Here today are the law students who will be completing their articles this year with the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General, the Court of Queen's Bench, and the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan. Earlier today, I had a chance to meet and speak with them. I am impressed by their enthusiasm, intelligence, and ambition. They are a clear indication of the bright future that lies ahead for Saskatchewan's legal profession. Mr. Speaker, our following guests are completing their articles with us at the Ministry of Justice. Deepu Ziwa is an alumnus of the Saskatchewan Legislative Internship Program. He graduated from the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. Deepu is the founder of a non-profit that engages young professionals and raises funds and awareness for Cystic Fibrosis Canada. Liam Fitzgerald has lived all over our province, completing his undergrad at the University of Regina and attending law school at the U of S. Currently, he is posted in La Ronge, where he looks forward to continuing his career with the Ministry of Justice and Public Prosecutions. Dustin Link enjoys international travel and spent a year teaching high school in a rural Chinese village. He studied law at the University of Saskatchewan, will be joining the Legal Services Division at the Ministry of Justice when he completes his articles. Ali Sparks comes to us from the University of Saskatchewan. While in law school, Ali had the opportunity to attend the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. When not working, she is an active volunteer in the community. She looks forward to continuing her career in the Regina Prosecution's Office. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to introduce our articling students from the Court of Appeal. Aaron Fritzler was born and raised in the beautiful Lumsden Valley. As a student, he was awarded Most Distinguished Graduate for both his undergraduate and Juris Doctor. This fall, Aaron will be pursuing an LLM at Cambridge on a full-ride scholarship. Following that, he will return to Saskatchewan to work for MLT Aikens in Regina. Originally hailing from, I think the former Minister of Justice making some derogatory remarks about some of the other law firms, and I know which firm the former minister came from, and I will quite willing to stick up for MLT Aikens, Mr. Speaker. Just having said the name. Mr. Speaker, originally hailing from Medicine Hat, Matthew Barnes attended law school here in our province. After finishing his articles, he will continue his career with MLT Aikens. He will also continue to surprise his family by proudly wearing Rough Rider green instead of Stampeder red. Sure. And you better promise. Firouz Rahimi came to Canada with his family in 2001. He is a proud refugee and a member of a strong and supportive Afghan-Canadian family. Following his clerkship, he plans to move to Calgary to begin a corporate practice. However, he will always maintain strong ties to and affection for Saskatchewan, and earlier today he committed to coming back relatively soon. Jeremy Barber has attended both of our province's fine universities, Mr. Speaker. He spent some time working for the Star Phoenix in Saskatoon, where he happened to meet his wife, Caitlin. Jeremy plans to pursue a career in private practice, focusing on the law as it relates to technology. Mr. Speaker, from the Court of Queen's Bench, I would like to introduce our final two articling students. Lara Bonakowski had an undergraduate in Women and Gender Studies and attended law school at the University of Saskatchewan. She enjoys spending her spare time with her 18-month-old son. Moving ahead, Lara intends to establish a career in public interest law. And finally, Mr. Speaker, during her studies, Desiree Steele was elected as the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union Vice President of Academic Affairs. She participated in the 2018 Dean's Forum on Access to Justice. She would also like to pass along the comment that she appreciates today's chance to observe the legislature's work. So to all the members, I'm sure they will want to be on their very best behavior. As always. Mr. Speaker, I can say to Desiree and indeed to all of the articling students that are here today, we appreciate them and their dedication to our justice system. It was a pleasure to meet all of them earlier today. I look forward to great things from them in the days to come and years to come, and their seats on the legislature floor for some of them on both sides of the House.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the minister in welcoming this fresh crop of nearly completed articling students and welcome them, first of all, to the profession and welcome them also to this Legislative Assembly. It's always inspiring to see the new batch of lawyers join the bar, whether or not they're staying in the province or otherwise. We always like to see them stay in Saskatchewan and hope that those that have chosen to move to another province come back home soon. Mr. Speaker, I hope that their experience within the ministry or whether or not they were clerking at Queen's Bench or Court of Appeal was a positive experience for them, and I'm sure they gained a lot of insights and knowledge that they'll be taking on for the rest of their careers. Mr. Speaker, I wish them all the best. I always find every year the batch of articling students that come through more and more intimidating with their CVs. Mr. Speaker, being significantly longer than mine was when I was their vintage. It's very exciting and inspiring for the profession, and I know they'll do great things moving forward, whether they're staying within the ministry or private practice or nonprofits. There's lots of great opportunities when you have that sort of degree, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask all members to join me again in welcoming these incredible group of professionals to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to introduce through you and to all members of the Assembly 39 fabulous students from the Humboldt Collegiate Institute in Humboldt. Accompanying them is their teachers David Miette and David Rowe. And this is, I don't know, sometime I'm going to have to ask Mr. Miette how often he has brought classes here because he is a frequent visitor here at the Assembly. It's great to see them, and I had a good visit with them earlier today, and I want everyone to welcome them to their Assembly.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Newtana.
Here. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's indeed my great pleasure to introduce one of the articling students here today, Ms. Desiree Steele. I've known Desiree for a long, long time in a much different context. Desiree is an amazing musician and plays the piano and the fiddle. She's accompanying her brother James, who's also a lawyer for many, many years in fiddle contests. And Desiree comes from an incredible family that is very generous in their community and with kind and loving hearts. And I think anyone who knows the Steele family would say that wholeheartedly. They're the most amazing family, and Desiree is definitely a product of that family. So I would like everyone to welcome Desiree Steele to her Legislative Assembly.
As a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the members also and introduce one of the articling student who happens to be my second cousin, Dustin Link. Hi. We don't usually see each other at these kind of formal events. We have a large family. Dustin's part of the Rancourt family. And we have a golf tournament every year, and so oftentimes I get to see Dustin there if he's not traveling, like the minister indicated that he's done some extensive traveling, and we're very proud of him. And I believe you might be the first lawyer in our family, so that's exciting to hear. So that'll be wonderful to have. So I'm so happy to see Dustin here, and we're so incredibly proud of all your accomplishments, and I'd ask that all the members welcome Dustin to his legislature.
Again, as a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to introduce someone very special to me in your gallery, Mr. Grayson Bowden, who's my spouse, who's joined us here today. We know that elections are not individual undertakings, and they are family affairs, and this is very true in our situation. I don't think either of us knew that we were signing up for 2 elections over the span of a year and a half, but we've made it through, and Grayson was right there by my side, pounding the pavement with me and knocking on doors. I think he ran into some of the members opposite in those settings as well. But aside from being my #1 door knocker, he is also a huge support person in all aspects of my life as well. I've thanked him many times in this assembly, but he's never been here to hear it, so I want to thank him for all of the support that he's provided, not just getting me here, but also supporting things from the home front while I'm away as well, which we know takes a significant toll. Grayson is a 5-6 French immersion teacher, grade 5-6 from Ecole Victoria School in Saskatoon. He's very dedicated to his students. He's involved in the Saskatoon Teachers Association. He's a master's student at the same time, and he finds ways to have hobbies and be a handyman as well, jack of all trades. And so I would ask all members to join me in welcoming him to his Legislative Assembly today.
Presenting petitions, recognize the member for Regina Pasqua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I do like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows. Respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action. To cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by citizens of Regina and citizens of Moose Jaw. I do so submit. Thank you, Mr.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned people, local businesses, and communities right across Saskatchewan as it relates to the Sask Party government's imposition of the PST onto construction labor, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this is the epitome of a job-killing tax, Mr. Speaker, at a time where we need to be creating jobs and welcoming investment, Mr. Speaker. We called on this government to reverse this when they brought it in. What the Sask Party government did is they saw a slowing economy and they slammed on the brakes, Mr. Speaker. And sadly, what we see is permits down all across Saskatchewan, thousands of Saskatchewan tradespeople who have been put out of work. So many of those tradespeople that have been forced to move outside Saskatchewan in pursuit of employment, Mr. Speaker, and it's really hurting our economy. We know that households have been hit hard by the PST, and that's relating to our very flat economy, Mr. Speaker. The average household, in fact, is now paying over $800 more per year in just over a 4-year period, Mr. Speaker, a 70% increase in PST, Mr. Speaker, for the average family. So we continue to call on the government to do the right thing and to make construction exempt and provide some relief from families that have been hit hard by the PST that they've imposed. The petition reads as follows. Amen. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents of Saskatoon. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition calling for a public inquiry and a forensic audit into the Regina bypass land scandal. The people who have signed this petition would like to bring to our attention the following. Land developers purchased 640 acres of land along Tower Road and had the Regina bypass moved to accommodate their developments. Thousands of people were impacted directly and lost land, homes, businesses, access, life's work, health, history, and their future. Land developers were paid up to 80 times more for their land than the long-term land, home, and business owners. The cost of the Regina bypass exploded from $400 million to over $2 billion, and Premier Brad Walz signed an order in Council to pay $21.1 million for land that was worth only $312,000. I'll read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call for a judicial public inquiry and forensic audit into the entire Regina bypass land scandal. And the folks who have signed this petition today are from Regina, Maple Creek, Avonhurst, and Markham. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following, that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside this province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But we know, Mr. Speaker, that over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. And we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. People would like us in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. And Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from the communities of Gravelbourg and Assiniboia. I do so present. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for the province to take real action to fight climate change. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners wish to bring to our attention that Saskatchewan produces the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in all of Canada. They want to bring to our attention that the Saskatchewan Party government slashed programs and funding for the environment, that the Saskatchewan Party government has failed to tackle climate change, and that under the Saskatchewan Party government, there has been a steady increase in payments under the Provincial Disaster Assistance Program, likely related to climate change. Mr. Speaker, The petitioners in the prayer respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan enact a real plan and allocate appropriate funding in the provincial budget to tackle climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, helping families transition to energy-efficient homes, and encouraging everyone in the province to take real action to protect the environment. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition are from Estevan and Southey, and I so present.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud today to present a petition to increase the funding to Prince Albert Mobile Crisis. Mr. Speaker, the individuals who signed these particular petitions wish to draw the following points to your attention. Due to a lack of funding, Prince Albert Mobile Crisis Unit has had to close its doors during daytime hours, resulting in a loss of resource to people in distress. The daytime closure of Prince Albert Mobile has put stress on Prince Albert Police Services, Victoria Hospital, and other agencies who may not be trained and or qualified to provide counselling and intervention services to clients. And Mr. Speaker, with our high rates of suicide within the northern part of the province, the loss of daytime hours for the Prince Albert Mobile Crisis has been such a disappointment. So the individuals who signed this all want me to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Saskatchewan Party government to increase funding to Prince Albert Mobile Crisis Unit so they may once again offer a 24-hour, 7 days a week emergency crisis service. Mr. Speaker, the individuals that signed these petitions, a lot of them come from Prince Albert, but many of them come from other communities in Saskatchewan because they're also concerned, and they come from the city of Saskatoon, McDowell, and Shelbrook. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a longtime Prince Albert Raiders fan and season ticket holder, I am ecstatic that yesterday they won the WHL Eastern Conference Championship against the Edmonton Oil Kings and will go on to meet the Vancouver Giants in the best of 7 in the WHL Championship.
All right.
In addition to attending as many games as I can in Prince Albert, I was excited to have the opportunity to travel to Edmonton during the Easter break to watch 2 of the games of the Raiders played there against the Oil Kings. In true Prince Albert style, when the Raider bus rolled into our city around midnight last night, fans were on hand to greet the return of our champs. When it comes to showing our players our appreciation and support, not one fan minded the late hour. I know that I and all of Prince Albert will be cheering hard as the Raiders play the Giants. Raider fans have waited a long time to earn the Eastern Championship again. We will be cheering even harder when the Raiders make it to the Memorial Cup Championship. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members join me in congratulating the Prince Albert Raiders on winning the Eastern Conference and offer our best wishes as they face the Giants. As well, I ask that all members join with me in congratulating the Edmonton Oil Kings on a great series. Go Raiders, go.
Recognize the member for Bigger Sask Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, April 22nd, the arm of Bigger and the surrounding area were threatened by a large out-of-control grass fire. The dry conditions and extreme high winds made the area and other parts of western Saskatchewan very susceptible to fire. Mr. Speaker, the town declared a state of an emergency and the Bigger Hospital and long-term care home had to be evacuated. Precautions were taken to ensure the safety of all residents was never in jeopardy. On behalf of the Minister of Health, the honourable member from Rosetown Elrose and myself, we wish to thank all of the hard-working firefighters and volunteers who risk everything to help the community. There are not enough words that can be used to express the amount of gratitude we have for each and every single person that shared this experience this past week. Thank you to Ray Sadler, Mayor of Bigger, Jan Marie DeMozak, Reeve of the REM of Bigger, Jerry Bessie, Bigger Fire Chief, and all the countless volunteer firefighters from Bigger and the surrounding communities, as well as Dwayne McKay, Provincial Fire Commissioner, and the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency for stepping up and showing unparalleled leadership and bravery when the community needed it most. To all the farmers, ranchers, contractors, Hudray colonies, RCMP officers, the pilots from the SEAT program, and everyone from the community who offered help in any way they could. our most sincere thanks.
As a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, this year from February 4th to 8th, College Park 1 and 2 retirement residences held the 10th annual All Seniors Care Seniors Games. The Seniors Games are held at 30 All Seniors Care Living Centres retirement residences and provide the opportunity for thousands of older adults to participate in friendly competition. The Games consist of several events that put the seniors' physical and mental abilities to the test, including shuffleboard, billiards, bocce ball, Kaiser, and cribbage. This year's theme celebrated the joy of dance. This added not only an additional dimension of fun to the events, but resulted in a flash mob dance party during the opening ceremonies at College Park 2.
Wait a minute.
It was my pleasure to attend the opening and closing ceremonies and bring greetings, along with members from Regina Walsh Acres and Regina Wascana Plains. This year, there were 32 gold medal winners. These medalists will be the first to tell you that the Seniors Games are never about winning medals, but the week of games and festivities are about exercise, participation, and most importantly, friendship. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in congratulating the gold medalists and all who participated this year. And thank you to those who organized this week of fun events. Their hard work has not gone unnoticed. Thank you.
And as a member for the Battlefords.
Speaker, it's indeed a delight for me to rise today to highlight the success of our local Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League team, the Battlefords North Stars. The Stars have concluded a great season in this, the 50th year of the SJHL, by winning the Canalda Cup for the second time in the last 3 seasons. This playoff run was truly amazing, with wins against Flin Flon in 7 games in round 1, a sweep of the Yorkton Terriers in 4 games in the semifinals, and the final series pitted the Stars against the Melfort Mustangs, and they wrapped that series up in 5 games. A solid core of talented veterans and great energy from all members of this team, along with stellar goaltending, has propelled this team through 3 rounds of SJHL playoffs, and now it's on to the Canalda Cup, or the Anavet Cup, pardon me, against the Manitoba champions, the Portage Terriers. I know that all of the SJHL teams, and indeed our whole province, is pulling for our provincial champions to win. The interprovincial series started in Portage last weekend with a split of the first 2 games. Now it's back home to North Battleford for games 3, 4, and 5. And I know our fans are anxiously anticipating some great hockey, and our Civic Centre will be packed and it will be loud as we cheer on our team. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in congratulating our Battlefords North Stars. Go Stars.
Recognize the member for Cypress Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm happy to announce that Shaunavan's own Haley Wickenheiser will be inducted into the 2019 class of the International Ice Hockey Federation Hall of Fame. Mr. Speaker, Haley retired from hockey 2 years ago, but her impact on the sport both nationally and across the world still remains strong. For many years in her career, she impressed the IIHF as she represented Canada on many occasions, and is well respected for both her skills and her leadership. She is the all-time leader in scoring at both the Olympics and the Women's Worlds, and won 4 Olympic golds during her time playing internationally. To add to her list of successes, she has named the most valuable player at both 2002 and 2006 Olympics. Mr. Speaker, Haley has been a dominant athlete since she was a young girl. Just at the age of 12, she was already playing at the U18 level tournament, not just as a bench warmer, but as a leading scorer in the MVP for her team. After she retired, she made NHL history when the Toronto Maple Leafs hired her as their assistant director for player development. Mr. Speaker, I now ask my colleagues to join me in congratulating Haley Wickenheiser on her introduction into the IIHF Hall of Fame class of 2019.
Recognize a member for Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Congratulations to the Maud Burke archery team on a fantastic run in the school program provincial tournament this year. In the new 3D shoot event, the team took gold with a score of 1,184. Individually in this event, Kaylin Dixon shot a 236, taking home the silver medal, and Reagan Nyman took the bronze. Reagan also went on to win first place in the target competition, winning a custom metallic red Matthews bow, a bow that you can only win and cannot buy, Mr. Speaker. In the target competition, the team earned a silver provincial medal with a total score of 2,680. Some more winners of the weekend included Ashley Federichka, winning the elementary girls silver medal, and pretty great for a new grade 4 archer, Mr. Speaker, as well as Delia Seawalk won and placed 7th, and Abby Wiseman placed 11th. A special congratulations to the grade 6 students in the senior team, who together earned the gold in their divisions. Mr. Speaker, we have some great talent on this team, and I'd like to thank all the staff and coaches, guys like Randy Stashik and Garrett Werkamp and Kelly Simpson, people who give of their life and their time to help these kids achieve their goals athletically, Mr. Speaker. And I now want to ask all members to please join me in congratulating the Maud Burke Archers for another successful tournament this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to announce that the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, or SHRF as they call it, and the Lung Association of Saskatchewan are strengthening their partnership and commitment to health research with a $1 million investment to address respiratory health in our province. I was fortunate enough to bring greetings to an event which highlighted this new investment, which will support respiratory health in all research areas. These areas include Indigenous people's health, respiratory disease control and management, patient caregiver education, sleep apnea, and other lung health areas. Mr. Speaker, this is a step toward delivering a future of better breathing for everyone here in Saskatchewan. Through education and research, SHRF and Lung Association of Saskatchewan can work to turn knowledge into action. Mr. Speaker, we appreciate the Lung Association for their long history of service, education, research, and advocacy to prevent lung disease and promote better health. We know that this collaboration will be helpful to people living with respiratory disease and other conditions, as well as support the important innovative projects that offer hope and better management of symptoms and improved health. Mr. Speaker, I now ask all colleagues to join me in recognizing SHRF and the Lung Association of Saskatchewan for their dedication to this partnership. Together, they are making Saskatchewan a healthier place to live. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
All right, with that, question period. I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister of Social Services complained that First Nations leaders were at the table for a meeting with the federal government on child welfare. He called them, quote, lobbyists, and dismissed the importance of having Indigenous leaders around the table to address the unacceptable number of children in care in Saskatchewan, and then doubled down on his comments by repeating that Indigenous leaders should not be at the table when discussing child welfare. Why did the minister call these elected leaders lobbyists, and how can he possibly justify excluding them from these essential conversations?
Hear, hear. I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to say for the record, I have the utmost respect for the Indigenous culture, history, and the elected representatives at a local, provincial, and national level. Mr. Speaker, I was wrong to use the word lobbyist last week in my interview. As I stated last week, Mr. Speaker, along with my provincial and territorial colleagues, we were very glad to have discussions with the federal government and the national Indigenous organizations in the room to discuss Bill C-92 and other items. We had also requested a separate meeting with just the federal minister to discuss the current process, such as timelines, current PT agreements, funding. At the end of the day, we were denied this meeting, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to update the House this morning. I was able to speak to Minister O'Regan, and he has agreed that we should have a conference call with the federal, provincial, and territorials. He confirmed this with me this morning. Mr. Speaker, the NIOs have had their space to be able to work with the federal government to raise their concerns. It is very important, Mr. Speaker, that we as provincial and territorial organizations have our space to be able to discuss C-92. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, instead of trying to pick fights with elected leaders and trying to divide, the minister should be working to find common ground. What's the minister's plan to repair his relationship with Indigenous leaders? Relationships that seem to be getting worse and worse with each passing day.
Hear, hear. I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, as this House well knows, the provincial government is responsible for all children within its jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, when we take this responsibility very seriously, we want to make sure that this new bill that is coming out, C-92, enhances and does not detract from our current agreements that we have, Mr. Speaker. We have recently had an agreement with Saskatoon Tribal Council, Mr. Speaker, where we were able to renegotiate our partnership agreement as well as other agreements to be able to make sure that we are looking out for children in care, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to let the House know that those agreements are in place, and we continue to work with our Indigenous leaders to make sure that all of our children are safe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, the bill is called an Act Respecting First Nations, Métis and Inuit Children, Youth and Families. How on earth would it be appropriate to discuss a law like this without Indigenous voices at the table?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I outlined in my first, we did have that discussion with the national Indigenous organizations. We had 2 federal ministers in the room as well as all the provincial and territorial ministers to be able to have that. We also had a presentation from Saskatoon Tribal Council on our partnership agreement, our first contact, and also the delegation agreement, where Saskatoon Tribal Council was very supportive of the way that this ministry and social services and our government in general was working with the children within the Saskatoon Tribal Council. We've had some early successes with that, Mr. Speaker, and we want to continue to build on that in the future with our local leaders as well as the national Indigenous organizations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, this is becoming a pattern from the Sask Party government. They called the leadership of the FSIN the night before the 60 Scoop apology for an invite. They failed to deliver on any of the recommendations from the 60 Scoop survivors. And now they're trying to sideline Indigenous leaders who should have a seat at the table when discussing a path towards child welfare. How can we expect this Sask Party government to make any progress on child welfare when they've shown that their actions, that they have zero interest in working respectfully with Indigenous leaders to do so?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'll point to our record. We have 18 delegation agreements. We just recently signed our new delegation agreement with the Saskatoon Tribal Council as well as our first contact. Chief Arcan talked to me earlier this morning, Mr. Speaker, to be able to discuss that they have had some recent successes. They have, from the first contact panel, within 48 hours, Mr. Speaker, they were able to make sure that 3 children didn't come into care. This is exactly what we're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that the prevention side is there, but if there is the circumstance where we do have to temporarily take a child into care, and, Mr. Speaker, we will backfill that with support for the parents as well as the child to make sure that the reunification can be very short and we can make sure that that family has the best opportunity to be successful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
The Sask Party used to talk a good game when it came to fixing our broken child welfare system, but they've totally failed to deliver any meaningful change after more than a decade in power. Back in 2010, the Sask Party promised a comprehensive overhaul of our child welfare system, and there's been no action since. Now the federal government is looking to give more control to Indigenous governments, and this government is dragging its feet and refusing to work with Indigenous leaders. Now let's talk about their record, Mr. Speaker. There's over 5,000 kids in the province in care today, and over 70% of them are Indigenous. They can't afford to see any more delays. When will we see the needed overhaul of our child welfare system that's so badly overdue?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and directly to the question. That's why we have to have these conversations with our federal counterparts to see what our local legislation here in Saskatchewan is going to be impacted by federal legislation, Mr. Speaker. There were some areas within that federal legislation that they're working on some amendments, Mr. Speaker, to be able to make sure that that we are putting the child at the centre of this, Mr. Speaker. We have also increased our funding, Mr. Speaker, to child and family protection officers and community-based organizations since 2007, Mr. Speaker, by 486%. Mr. Speaker, we continue to have work with our children in care, but we also want to make sure that we're supporting the parents, we're supporting the persons of sufficient interest, and we're also supporting the foster families to make sure that that child has best opportunity to be successful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert and Northcote.
Children and families deserve so much better than they're getting from this government. We need to reduce the number of children in care today, and there's so much more the government could be doing for families. They could ensure parents have the mental health and addiction supports they need. They could increase the minimum wage to help strengthen vulnerable families. They could restore the rental housing supplement and increase the availability of safe, affordable housing. And they could deliver on their promised overhaul of our child welfare system. Instead, we've seen a decade of inaction while more and more kids have slipped through the cracks. When will the Sask Party get serious about reducing the number of kids in care?
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, we are working with all of our community-based organizations and our community partners to make sure that no child comes into care. Mr. Speaker, that's why we have our positive parenting programs, Mr. Speaker, to be able to make sure that we get into those families and be able to help out before the child needs to come into the custody of social services. And even when that happens, Mr. Speaker, when we do have to temporarily take a child into custody, we always look at persons of sufficient interest. We look at family members, we look at community, we look at people that are very close to that individual so they can maintain their connection with their family, with their culture, and with their community, Mr. Speaker. We are working continuously on this. The children that actually are in care in the custody of social services, Mr. Speaker, is going down. The children that are in person with persons of sufficient interest and with family members, where we, as well as community members, feel it is best for them, is holding solid. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Again, as a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, we spent a lot of time asking the Minister of Rural and Remote Health to clarify his position on fully funding Mifigay-Miso, but we have yet to get a real response. As he and the Minister of Health play hot potato with this important decision, real people are being impacted by the delay. Many pharmacies across Saskatchewan are not stocking Mifigay-Miso, and this is because it isn't universally covered. Wendy Norman, a professor of faculty in medicine at the University of British Columbia, a family planning researcher, said pharmacies are unlikely to stock a pricey medication with low demand because it's not available for free. Will the minister commit to fully funding Mifigay-Miso, or will he leave people across the province without access?
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the news story that the opposition member is referring to speaks about the accessibility of Mifigay-Miso because in many instances across the province, Mr. Speaker, it's not available on the shelf in pharmacies. But, Mr. Speaker, that simply doesn't mean that it's not accessible. Mr. Speaker, in many pharmacies in rural Saskatchewan, remote areas of the province, pharmacists order pharmaceuticals on an as-needed basis when it's not ones that are frequently used, Mr. Speaker. In many cases, in most cases, I believe, Mr. Speaker, it's couriered there the next day. Mr. Speaker, I've had a number of pharmacists tell me that, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of Mifigay-Miso, which we've discussed many, many times in this House, Mr. Speaker. As I've told the member opposite and all members of this Assembly, it's currently under review from the Ministry. When they're done, we'll have a discussion about it. We'll decide whether or not it'll be universally funded, Mr. Speaker. That should be done in the next number of weeks.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about that story. Stephanie Taylor of the Canadian Press contacted 83 community pharmacies across Saskatchewan, in cities and in rural Saskatchewan. 79 reported that they did not have it on their shelves. Only 4 pharmacies reported carrying this important drug, a drug that is less costly than surgical abortions and more accessible for rural and remote residents. This is medicine that's safe and that should be accessible everywhere. Wendy Norman clarified the link between fully covering mifegammiso and its availability, quote, "When it's not a business decision, when people can afford the medication, pharmacies stock it," end quote. With the evidence piling up, will the minister stop stalling and commit to fully funding mifegammiso today?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we're certainly not stalling, as the member opposite called it. Mr. Speaker, we are having ministry officials do a review. That should be done in due course. We'll reevaluate it at that time, Mr. Speaker. Again, as I mentioned, this isn't just about mifegammiso, Mr. Speaker. It's very common for many pharmaceuticals to not be stocked on the shelves. Pharmaceuticals tend to have an expiry date. The pharmacist, if they're ordering them in and it expires, there's obviously a loss in revenue there, Mr. Speaker. It's not just mifegammiso. I know examples in my own family with a biologic that's not frequently prescribed, Mr. Speaker. It's not available in pharmacy in my home community of Rosetown, but they'll order it in and it's available the next day. It would be the same with mifegammiso, Mr. Speaker. It's the same with universally covered drugs, the drugs that we use for HIV coverage, Mr. Speaker. In many instances, pharmacies don't have those available on the shelf, but they order them in on an as-needed basis. It's part of the whole spectrum of pharmaceuticals that are available, Mr. Speaker. Pharmacists often do this.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, it's been nearly 4 years since Health Canada approved mifegammiso, and now women in rural areas are waiting longer for access.
Right, exactly.
If the evidence, the experts, and common sense aren't enough to convince this government to fully cover mifegammiso, maybe the words of someone who's used it will. Lise from Saskatoon has said in the Canadian Press story that if the drug was not covered by her insurance plan, she wouldn't have been able to afford mifegammiso at all. Quote, "I'm not in the financial position where I can just whip out $400, end quote. Lise is not alone. When 56% of Saskatchewan people say they are $200 or less away from financial insolvency at the end of the month, there's simply no debating that cost is a barrier for accessing this drug. And because of the government's refusal to fully cover mifegammiso, more people like Lise are left with no good option. Once again, will the minister commit to fully funding mifegammiso? And if not, what does he have to say to people like Lise who need to access it but wouldn't qualify for emergency assistance?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, to specifically answer that question, Mr. Speaker, again, as I've said many times in this House, there's an emergency assistance plan in place for people who don't have the financial wherewithal to cover their pharmaceuticals. Mr. Speaker, we're not delaying this decision. Mr. Speaker, as I've told the members opposite, we're doing the review. The ministry's doing the review. When they provide the information, Mr. Speaker, I'll have the discussion with Cabinet. Mr. Speaker will make that decision going forward. Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out in the last number of weeks, as we've discussed this many times, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite have been criticizing the Minister of Rural and Remote Health that somehow he's causing an obstacle and he's not allowing proper process to be followed, which is not the case, Mr. Speaker. But now in this case, again, they say don't follow proper process, just simply cover it because we say so. Right. Mr. Speaker, we're going to do neither of those things. The ministry is going to complete their review. They're going to provide the information. I'm going to have the discussion, Mr. Speaker, and we'll make that decision in due course.
Here, here. As the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, across the province, producers are having to make some tough choices as they prepare for seeding. Canola producers who are already impacted by the trade dispute with China have been watching prices collapse, and they're anticipating yet another squeeze on tight margins. We support the calls to ramp up diplomatic and scientific effort, but those efforts could take months, if not years, Mr. Speaker, and farmers can't wait that long. Last week, APAS called for short-term support from the province and from the feds. They want Saskatchewan crop insurance to step up and provide additional staff support. They want to see agri-stability coverage enhanced. They want to see 2019 enrollment fees scrapped, and they want an option for interim payments. Will the minister commit to offering this support today?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this obviously is a very serious issue for the agriculture community here in the province of Saskatchewan. We met with the federal ministers at the end of March in Saskatoon. We put a proposal on the table that we thought was very doable as far as the federal government acting on it. We are still waiting patiently for that answer and that response to them. I do have a call with the federal minister tomorrow. I have a discussion about this, Mr. Speaker. It is a very serious problem. We know there's farmers out there with cash flow problems, and that's why we put the cash advance program proposal to the federal government, interest-free to the farmers. It's a good proposal. It's a good perspective, and we'd hope that the federal government will act on it very soon. He's right, Mr. Speaker. This is long overdue. This problem should have been solved, and our proposal should have been acted on a lot sooner, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That sounds like a lot more talk, but not a lot of action. Mr. Speaker, if this government wants to actually stand up for Saskatchewan, it takes more than pointing fingers at Ottawa. It takes more than talk. It takes actually stepping up to help producers with actual measures. Today, it's been reported that Canadian pork, soybeans, and peas have been held up now in Chinese ports. This trade war with China is escalating, and the dispute could be devastating to Saskatchewan exporters, and there's no end in sight. In the Premier's own words, producers are running out of time. So my question to the Minister, what is the strategy to address this crisis? What's the Minister doing besides talking? What will the province be doing to support impacted producers?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, this is a very serious issue for the producers here in the province of Saskatchewan, agriculture, with the issues we're having with China. We've offered full support to the federal government. We've offered to be part of a technical team to get over to China and have a discussion with them. We are still waiting for an answer from China to see whether a technical team will be allowed to go over there, Mr. Speaker. There's the other side of this thing, and it's China letting us in to have that discussion with them, Mr. Speaker. And that's the problem we're dealing with right now, Mr. Speaker.
Here, here. As a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seeding is a very uncertain time of year for farmers. And while we're on the topic of farm margins getting squeezed, on top of the impacts of carbon pricing, inclement weather, and trade disputes, there's a proposal now by the federal government to change the seed regulations that would enable big seed companies to collect additional royalties on seed grown and saved by farmers. Producers have already signaled that they strongly oppose these proposals.
Order, please. Order, please. Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, producers have already signaled that they strongly oppose these proposals by the federal government, but we're still waiting to hear what the province's position is. The last time I asked the minister, he hadn't made up his mind, even though Saskatchewan farmers still have. Will the Saskatchewan Party government be standing with APAS, Sask Wheat, Sask Barley Development Commission, Prairie Oats, and the National Farmers Union, all of whom do not want to see these proposed changes go ahead?
I recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to hear the member opposite say that farmers are impacted by a carbon tax. He's right; they're impacted by a carbon tax. Hugely, Mr. Speaker, and it's not just the exemption on fuel. They'll be to have a carbon tax on every nut, bolt, and washer that they purchase on their farm, Mr. Speaker. We already know that trucking costs are going up, Mr. Speaker. There's all kinds of challenges around the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. In his question on the seed thing, Mr. Speaker, we know the federal government is going to do another round of consultation, Mr. Speaker. They haven't announced when they're going to do that. We will meet with industry leaders after that second round of consultation is put forward, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. As a member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, the online consultations that the minister refers to were supposed to begin in March. They've now been pushed back till June. And despite months of consultations, farmers are wondering why this provincial government is silent. Farmers need this this provincial government's help in opposing these changes. Farmers and farm groups have been clear about what they want. They want the right to grow and save their own seed. They don't want additional royalties charged when crop is sold. They do want guarantees that the research that they pay for be controlled and directed by farmers. Does the government support the right of farmers to save and use their own seed? Does the government oppose trailing royalties on farmer-saved seed? And will this government guarantee that farmers will control and direct the seed research that they pay through checkoffs and royalties? What's this government's position?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said in this Assembly before, and I'll say it again, we will consult with the industry when the consultation process is underway again by the federal government. It might not be either one of the two recommendations that have been put forward by the federal government. It might be a third recommendation that will come from the industry, Mr. Speaker. We will, and unlike the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, we will consult with industry. We will have that meeting with them, and we will come forward with a recommendation.
Order, please. Minister can finish his answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will consult with the industry leaders when we bring them to the table. We'll have that discussion, and we will put forward a presentation or a recommendation based on the impact that those industries have made to us as a government, Mr. Speaker. We will listen to the industry here in the province, unlike the members opposite, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, I always think it's telling when you ask a simple answer and you don't get an answer. Mr. Speaker, the question for the minister, just to refresh his memory, does the government support the right of farmers to save and use their own seed? Does the government oppose trailing royalties on farmer-saved seed? And will this government guarantee that farmers will control and direct the seed research that they pay through checkoffs and royalties?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
As I've said before, and I will continue to say it again, Mr. Speaker, we are going to consult with the industry leaders, with the farm organizations here in the province of Saskatchewan when that second round of federal consultation starts. We don't know when it's going to start. We know it's been postponed again till June. It could be postponed even later than that, Mr. Speaker. Once that second round of consultations, I've met with many industry organizations here in the province, and I've assured them that, Mr. Speaker, that when we see those recommendations coming out, we will get together as farm organizations and the provincial government, and we will take a recommendation to the federal government at that time. But we will be consulting with industry leaders, unlike the members opposite, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, farmers have already been consulted with this. They were consulted in December, they were consulted in January, they were consulted in February. Mr. Speaker, the provincial government was at those meetings. Mr. Speaker, the minister says he's been at those meetings. The question is simple, Mr. Speaker. Does the government support the right of farmers to save and use their own seed? Does the government oppose trailing royalties on farmer-saved seed? And will this government guarantee that farmers will get to control and direct the seed research that they pay through checkoffs and royalties?
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is an interesting day where the opposition has raised a number of important topics, Mr. Speaker. With respect to seed royalties, as the minister has said time and time again in this House, Mr. Speaker, that we will continue to work with the agricultural organizations across this province to ensure that we are moving forward and standing up for the great agriculture industry that we have here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will continue in exactly the same way, working with those agricultural organizations on the seed royalty system as we move forward, as we have on the trade file, the ever so important trade file here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to stand up not only with our agriculture industry when it comes to engaging with China, of which we have put proposals forward to the federal government, and we have asked them to respond, Mr. Speaker. What we have not seen is any proposed solutions from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. In the same way, when it comes to Bill C-69, we see proposals being put forward by this government, Mr. Speaker, nothing from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to Bill C-48, we'll see the Minister of Energy Resources moving forward, Mr. Speaker, testifying on that bill, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to a federally imposed carbon tax on the hardworking families of this province, Mr. Speaker, we see this government standing with the people of the province, Mr. Speaker, contrary to the member from Regina Northeast who thinks, and I quote, people don't vote using their heads. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we most certainly think they do.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Written question, question number 77, asked by Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 77 through 84.
Ordered 77 through 84. Recognize Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, so the committees may do the good work this afternoon, I move this House to now adjourn.
Move that the Assembly to now adjourn. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.